The rocks tore at the hem of her habit, a sound like a final, ragged prayer in the suffocating dark. Sister Agnes scrambled down the ravine, her breath a raw fire in her lungs, each gasp stolen from the frigid Colorado night. The infant strapped to her chest was a precious, terrifying weight, a fragile life whose fate was now bound to the strength of her own failing legs. Lily's small cries were muffled by the thick wool of her cloak and the roar of the river below, a hungry sound that seemed to mock the emptiness of the wilderness. Above them, on the cliff's edge she had fled not an hour ago, came the sounds that had haunted her flight for a full day and night, the baying of hounds and the sharp, angry shouts of men. Father Michael's men. He would not relent. He would hunt her to the ends of the earth to reclaim what he believed was the convent's property, the child, and her own broken vows. This was not just an escape. It was a desperate plunge into a world she had long ago abandoned, a world that now seemed determined to devour her whole. Her foot slipped on a patch of loose scree. Agnes fell hard, twisting to shield the baby with her body. The impact jarred a pained whimper from Lily and sent a shock of fire up Agnes's own bruised ribs. For a moment, she lay there, the rough stone biting into her cheek, the sounds of pursuit seeming to grow closer, louder. Defeat was a tempting whisper in the wind. She could simply lie here, let them find her, and accept the brutal penance that would surely follow. But then, a small, trusting hand pushed out from the sling, its tiny fingers curling into the fabric of her habit. It was a simple, reflexive movement, yet it reignited the fierce, protective fire in Agnes's soul. This child, abandoned by the world and condemned by the righteous, had no one else. Agnes was her only shield, her only hope. With a guttural sob that was part pain and part resolve, she pushed herself back to her feet and staggered onward, deeper into the shadowed maw of the canyon. As a cold, unforgiving dawn finally broke, painting the towering rock faces in shades of gray and bruised purple, the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by an even more daunting silence. The mountains were a new, indifferent threat. Exhausted and near collapse, Agnes found a shallow alcove behind a curtain of withered vines and sank to the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. She unwrapped Lily, her heart clenching at the sight of the baby's pale, pinched face. The infant's cries, which had been weak and intermittent through the night, now grew into a thin, reedy wail of pure hunger. "I know, little one," Agnes whispered, her own voice cracking. "I know." She had a small portion of dried bread left, but nothing for an infant who had not had a proper feeding in over a day. Desperation was a physical ache, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. It was then that she saw it, a thin, almost invisible trail of smoke curling into the morning sky from behind a jagged outcropping of rock further down the canyon. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant a person. It was a terrifying prospect, but the baby's cries were growing weaker, and Agnes knew she had no other choice. She re-secured Lily in the sling and forced her trembling legs to move, following the fragile promise of smoke. The camp, when she found it, was a testament to a life stripped to its barest essentials. A crude lean-to built against the canyon wall, a blackened fire pit with a pot hanging over the coals, and a mine shaft that gaped like a wound in the rock face. A man stood by the fire, his back to her, his broad shoulders filling out a worn flannel shirt. He was sharpening the head of a pickaxe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on metal the only sound besides the wind. He seemed to sense her presence before she made a sound, a sudden stillness in his work, a subtle tensing of his shoulders. He turned slowly, and Agnes's breath caught in her throat. He was a formidable figure, tall and powerfully built, with a thick, untrimmed beard and sun-weathered skin. But it was his eyes that held her captive, a pale, chilling gray, like a winter sky, and filled with the profound weariness of a man who had seen too much of the world and wanted no more of it. He watched her approach with the cold, wary stillness of a wolf watching an intruder in its territory. The baby chose that moment to let out another pitiful cry. The man's gaze dropped to the bundle on Agnes's chest, and his expression, already hard, seemed to turn to granite. Agnes stopped a dozen feet from his fire, her body swaying with exhaustion. The words she had rehearsed in her mind, pleas for help, for mercy, died on her lips. In the face of this man's profound isolation, such words seemed meaningless. He looked at her torn habit, her scratched face, the crying infant, and the judgment in his eyes was clear. She was trouble. She was a disruption. She was a problem he did not want. "Keep walking," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. It was not a suggestion, it was a command. Tears of desperation pricked at Agnes's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Please," she managed, the word a raw croak. "The baby. She's hungry. I have nothing for her." The man's gaze was unflinching. "Not my concern." He turned back to his pickaxe, the scraping sound resuming with a finality that struck Agnes like a physical blow. It was over. She had failed. They would die here, in this cold, indifferent canyon. The thought sent a wave of dizziness through her, and her vision began to tunnel. She sank to her knees, the last of her strength gone, vaguely aware of Lily's cries softening into weak, exhausted whimpers. The scraping stopped. Agnes looked up through a haze of defeat to see the man standing over her, his large frame blocking the rising sun. He was holding out a tin cup of water and a piece of hardtack. His expression had not softened, but the absolute dismissal was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name. A reluctant, begrudging flicker of humanity. "The baby can't eat that," Agnes whispered, her throat raw. "I know," he grunted. "That's for you. You're no good to her dead." He nudged the cup closer. "Drink." She took it with a trembling hand, the cool water a shock to her parched throat. He watched her for a long moment, then gave a curt gesture toward the fire. "You can stay till she's quieted. Then you move on." It wasn't kindness. Not really. It was a temporary truce with his own conscience. But for Agnes, it was everything. She murmured her thanks and crawled closer to the fire, huddling with Lily, trying to share what little warmth her own body still possessed. He retreated to the far side of the camp, his presence a constant, unnerving weight. He said nothing more, and as the day wore on, Agnes felt the full weight of his silence. This was his kingdom, and she was an unwelcome specter. As night fell again, bringing a deep, penetrating cold, Agnes knew they could not survive another night in the open. Lily had finally cried herself into a fitful sleep, but her small body was cool to the touch. The man, he had not offered a name, had thrown a few more logs on the fire before disappearing into his mine shaft, leaving them alone in the vast, echoing darkness. He returned hours later, his face grimed with dust, and seemed surprised to find them still there. He said nothing, simply adding more wood to the fire before settling on the far side with his back to them. Sometime in the deepest hour of the night, Lily began to cry again, a weak, feverish sound that tore at Agnes's heart. She tried to soothe her, rocking her, humming a desperate, tuneless lullaby, but the baby was inconsolable. The man stirred from his bedroll, the sound of his movement making Agnes flinch. He was going to throw them out now, into the cold and the dark. He rose and walked over, his shadow falling over them. Agnes looked up, bracing herself for the inevitable command to leave. He stood there for a long moment, just looking down at the crying infant in her arms. The firelight carved deep lines into his face, revealing a pain so profound, so deeply etched, it seemed a part of the man himself. Then, his calloused, trembling hand reached out. It hovered in the air for a heartbeat before gently, almost reverently, touching Lily's cheek. The gesture was so at odds with his gruff demeanor that it made Agnes's breath catch. A sound escaped his lips, a name, whispered so softly it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Mary, the name, a fragile ghost of a word, hung in the cold air between them. Thomas snatched his hand back as if the baby's skin had scorched him. The brief window into his soul slammed shut, the profound pain in his eyes vanishing behind a mask of granite. He took a half step back, his entire body rigid with a regret so sharp it was almost a physical force. "Just a passing thought," he muttered, his voice a low growl of dismissal. He turned away abruptly, striding back to his bedroll on the far side of the fire, leaving Agnes with a heart that beat a wild, confused rhythm against her ribs. Mary, the name echoed in the silence, a key to a lock she could not see. Who was she? A lost love? A sister? A daughter? The last thought sent a chill through Agnes that had nothing to do with the night air. She looked down at Lily, now quiet in her arms, and 1,000 new questions bloomed in the fertile ground of her fear. This man was not just a recluse. He was a man haunted by a specific ghost, a ghost who shared a name with a memory so powerful it could break through his formidable walls. An uneasy and unspoken routine took root in the days that followed. It was a life built on silence and peripheral vision. Thomas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and deliberate. When Agnes emerged from the lean-to, she would find a tin plate with a portion of oatmeal or a piece of smoked meat left on a flat stone near the fire, a silent offering from a man who would not share his hearth but would not let them starve. He would then take his pickaxe and disappear into the dark maw of the mine, the faint, rhythmic chink of his labor the only proof of his presence for most of the day. He was a phantom in their lives, a provider of necessities who demanded nothing in return but to be left alone. Agnes, for her part, focused her entire world on the fragile life in her arms. She used the tin cup Thomas had given her to boil water from the creek, sterilizing the strips of cloth she used for Lily's diapers. She washed them in the frigid, rushing water, her hands growing raw and chapped, but she worked with a single-minded devotion. She was a mother in all but name, and the fierce, primal love she felt for Lily was the one solid thing in a world that had become unmoored. Her own fear and guilt were constant companions. At night, she dreamed of Father Michael's cold fury, of the high convent walls that had once represented sanctuary and now felt like the gates of a prison. She had broken her sacred vows, fled her post, stolen a child. In the eyes of the church, her sins were absolute. But then she would wake to Lily's soft breathing, and the guilt would recede, replaced by the fierce certainty that she had done the only thing her soul would allow. One evening, as a lavender dusk settled over the canyon, Lily began to fuss. She was not hungry or cold, but simply restless, her small face crumpled in a wordless protest against the vast, quiet world. Agnes held her close, rocking her gently by the fire. Seeking a comfort from a life she had left behind, she began to sing. It was a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, a simple, melancholic tune with words like whispered secrets. Hush now, little bird, the sun has fled, the silver moon watches your bed. The mountain sleeps, the river sighs, close your weary, weeping eyes. Her voice was soft, barely a thread of sound against the crackle of the fire, but it seemed to fill the small clearing with a warmth that had long been absent. Lily's fussing softened into a contented sigh, her small body relaxing against Agnes's chest. She did not see Thomas return. He emerged from the mine shaft as silent as a shadow, his face grimy with the day's labor, his body weary. He stopped dead at the edge of the firelight, concealed by the deepening twilight. He had heard the singing, a faint melody carried on the wind, and it had drawn him out. The song, it hit him not like a memory, but like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. It was Sarah's lullaby, the exact tune, the same gentle cadence she had used to soothe their own daughter to sleep. The sound was a key turning in a rusted lock, throwing open a door he had nailed shut 2 years ago. An image flooded his mind, so vivid it was almost a hallucination. Sarah, her face illuminated by candlelight, rocking their baby, Mary, singing that very song. The pain of it was a white-hot agony, a fresh wound torn open. He could not breathe, he could not move. He could only listen as this strange woman sang his wife's song to another man's child, oblivious to the ghost she had summoned. He could not let her see him like this, his composure shattered, his grief a raw, naked thing. As silently as he had appeared, Thomas retreated back into the shadows, the darkness of the mine a welcome shroud for a man whose carefully constructed defenses had just been breached by the echo of a lullaby. Agnes never knew he had been there, but in the days that followed, she sensed a subtle shift. Thomas's silence seemed heavier, more freighted with unspoken sorrow. She would catch him staring into the fire, his gray eyes lost in a landscape of memory she could not fathom. Once, she woke in the night to find an extra blanket, thick and coarse, laid over her and Lily. Another morning, a small stack of firewood, neatly split and much larger than she could have managed herself, was waiting by the lean-to. He was still a ghost, but he was a watchful one. Her fear of him had all but evaporated, replaced by a cautious, aching empathy. He was not a monster. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own pain. The change in the weather came without warning. One afternoon, the brilliant blue Colorado sky turned the color of a leaden bruise. The wind, which had been a constant, gentle whisper, began to howl through the canyon, a mournful, predatory sound. Then the snow began. Not the gentle flakes of a winter morning, but thick, wet clumps, driven horizontally by the gale. In less than an hour, the world was a churning vortex of white. The blizzard forced them into the cramped confines of the lean-to. Thomas built up the fire until it roared, a defiant beast of warmth against the encroaching cold. They sat in their usual silence, separated by the flames, listening to the storm rage. It was just after nightfall that Agnes noticed Lily's breathing had changed. It was shallow and quick, a faint rasp accompanying each exhalation. She touched the baby's forehead. It was burning hot. "Thomas," she said, her voice sharp with a sudden, sickening dread. He looked over, his eyes questioning. "It's the baby. She's burning with fever." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile piece she had found. She unwrapped Lily, trying to cool her small body, but the baby's skin remained fiery to the touch. Her breathing grew more ragged, a desperate, pathetic sound against the fury of the storm. Agnes was a nun, a teacher of children, not a healer. She felt a terrifying wave of powerlessness wash over her. Thomas rose and came to her side of the fire, crouching down to look at the infant. He watched for a long, silent moment, his face grim, the firelight flickering in his haunted gray eyes. The scene was an agonizing echo of a past he could not escape. "She's sick," Agnes whispered, tears she could not stop welling in her eyes. "I don't know what to do." Thomas's jaw tightened. He looked from the sick child to the desperate woman, and something in his expression shifted. The paralyzed grief that had held him captive for 2 years gave way to a grim, focused resolve. He was the only one who could help. He had to act. "There's an old healer's trick my wife used to use," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the wind. He met Agnes's terrified gaze, his own eyes filled with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless, yet steady with a purpose she had not seen before. "Pass her to me." The storm howled, a physical manifestation of the grief and fear that swirled within the small lean-to. For a heart-stopping moment, Agnes clutched Lily tighter, her maternal instincts warring with the desperate hope that this stranger held the key to the baby's survival. In Thomas's eyes, she saw not the cold recluse, but a man wrestling with his own ghosts, his offer born from a place of profound pain. With a small, choked prayer, she relinquished her precious bundle into his large, calloused hands. Thomas took the infant with a gentleness that was achingly at odds with his rugged exterior. He held Lily for a moment, his gaze fixed on her small, feverish face. And for an instant, Agnes was certain he was looking at another child, in another time. Then, the memory passed, replaced by a focused intensity. "We need to break the fever," he said, his voice a low command that cut through the chaos of the storm. "And we need to do it slowly. The shock of too much cold could be worse than the heat." He moved with a sureness that was both surprising and deeply reassuring. He instructed Agnes to gather fresh, clean snow in a tin plate, while he retrieved a small, buckskin pouch from his own meager belongings. From it, he took a pinch of dried, brittle leaves. "Willow bark," he explained, his voice tight. "Sarah, my wife, she swore by it for fevers." He showed Agnes how to crush the bark into a fine powder using 2 flat stones. As they worked side by side, their hands nearly touching in the flickering firelight, the space between them, once a chasm of silence, became a bridge of shared purpose. He mixed a tiny amount of the powdered bark with a spoonful of melted snow, creating a thin, bitter paste. "Just a little on her tongue," he murmured, more to himself than to Agnes. "Enough to fight the fire inside." He administered the remedy with a surprising delicacy, his large finger gently prying open Lily's mouth and swiping the paste inside. Throughout the long, dark night, they worked as a team. They bathed Lily's small body with snow-chilled cloths, a slow, methodical process of cooling her fiery skin. They took turns holding her, murmuring words of encouragement, their voices a quiet counterpoint to the storm's relentless fury. The shared task, the desperate focus on the fragile life in their hands, began to unravel the tightly wound threads of Thomas's silence. "The fever came on just like this," he said suddenly, his gaze lost in the dancing flames. "Fast? One day she was laughing. The next." His voice broke, and he swallowed hard before continuing. "Mary, my daughter, she was just 6 months old." Agnes remained silent, her heart aching for the raw pain in his voice. She knew this was a sacred confidence, A story wrested from the very depths of his soul. Sarah and I, we just built our first real cabin, not a lean-to like this. Had a proper window with real glass. A sad, fleeting smile touched his lips. We were so proud of that window. Sarah planted flowers beneath it. He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing a past Agnes could only imagine. I was away, had to be, selling a season's worth of gold in Denver. It was a 3-week trip. I didn't want to go, but we needed the supplies for winter. He fell silent for a long moment, the only sounds the wind and Lily's ragged breathing. When I got back, he began, then stopped, the words caught in his throat. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The cabin was empty, just silent, a neighbor told me. The fever had swept through the settlement while I was gone. Took Sarah and Mary within a day of each other. They were buried in the town cemetery before I even knew they were sick. His voice was a flat, dead thing, stripped of all emotion. I wasn't there to hold them. I wasn't there to help. The guilt was a physical presence in the small space, a weight so heavy it seemed to press the very air from the lean-to. It wasn't your fault, Agnes whispered, the words feeling horribly inadequate. Thomas shook his head, a gesture of profound self-recrimination. I left them, and when I came back, my world was gone. I couldn't stay in that cabin. Couldn't look at that window. So I came here, somewhere no one could find me, somewhere I had nothing left to lose. His confession hung in the air, a raw testament to the tragedy that had hollowed him out. In that moment of shared vulnerability, Agnes felt compelled to offer a piece of her own brokenness. I was an orphan, she said softly, her eyes on the sleeping baby. My parents died of cholera when I was 5. The convent was the only home I ever knew. She told him of the suffocating piety, the cold, rigid rules, and the crushing authority of Father Michael. She spoke of Lily, an infant left at the convent gates, a tiny, sickly thing the other nuns had deemed a burden, a mark of sin on their sacred doorstep. They wanted to send her to the Magdalene Asylum, Agnes said, her voice trembling with remembered outrage. A place of hard labor and harder hearts. They said it was for her own good, to cleanse the sin of her conception. Her hand gently stroked Lily's cheek, but when I held her, I felt a connection I can't explain. It was like she was a part of my own soul. I knew I couldn't let them send her away. So I ran. Their stories, so different in their details, were echoes of the same fundamental theme: loss, guilt, and a desperate, protective love. 2 solitary souls, each trapped in their own private storm, had found an unexpected harbor in one another. As the first pale hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the blizzard's fury began to subside. And with the calming of the storm, Lily's breathing seemed to ease. The rasping sound softened, her small body relaxed, and the feverish heat began to recede from her skin. She was going to live. The shared, unspoken thought was a fragile, beautiful thing in the quiet of the dawn. Exhaustion, profound and bone-deep, settled over them. Thomas gently took the sleeping infant from Agnes and placed her in the makeshift cradle she had fashioned from a wooden crate. He then took a blanket and draped it around Agnes's shoulders, a gesture of simple, unadorned care. You should sleep, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'll watch over her. Agnes nodded, too weary to argue. She curled up by the fire, the warmth a welcome comfort, and for the first time since her flight from the convent, she slept without fear. When she woke, the sun was streaming into the lean-to. The world outside was a pristine, breathtaking expanse of white, the snow muffling all sound, creating a sense of profound peace. Thomas sat by the fire, watching Lily, who was sleeping soundly, her breathing even and clear. The crisis had passed. A fragile peace settled over the camp in the days that followed. The snowbound canyon became their entire world, a sanctuary from the threats that lay beyond. They spoke more now, filling the silences with the tentative sharing of memories and thoughts. They were no longer just 2 strangers, but fellow survivors, bound by the shared ordeal of saving a child's life. It was on the 3rd day after the storm, as Agnes was washing Lily's few garments in the creek, that she found it. The water was so clear she could see the smooth stones on the bottom. As she wrung out the last of Lily's swaddling blankets, her fingers brushed against something hard and small, tucked into a fold of the hem. Curious, she worked it free. It was a locket, tarnished and small, no bigger than her thumbnail. It was made of silver, with a delicate, scrolling pattern on its surface. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She had washed these blankets a dozen times. How had she never noticed it before? With trembling fingers, she pried it open. Inside, there was no miniature portrait as she might have expected. Instead, etched into the silver in tiny, exquisite script, was a single word. A name, Sarah. Agnes stared at it, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. The name of Thomas's dead wife, engraved in a locket, hidden in the blanket of the baby she had saved. Coincidence? It was impossible. The connection was too direct, too specific. Her gaze flew to Thomas, who was reinforcing the lean-to, his back to her. The fragile trust she had so painstakingly built felt as if it were shattering like thin ice. Had he known all along? Was Lily's presence here not a random act of fate, but part of a story she did not understand? A wave of cold suspicion washed over her, chilling her more than the icy creek water. She snapped the locket shut, the small click loud in the stillness of the canyon. She had to know the truth, but as she watched the solitary figure of the man who had shared his deepest grief with her, she felt a profound sense of dread. The answer, she feared, would change everything. The silver locket felt like a shard of ice in Agnes's palm. The name Sarah, a silent, damning accusation, seemed to burn through the metal into her skin. She looked from the tiny, perfect letters to the broad, unknowing back of the man who had just begun to earn her trust. Every instinct screamed that this was no coincidence. The lullaby, the name Mary whispered in the night, and now this. It was a pattern, a series of echoes from a past she had stumbled into blindly. Her first impulse was to confront him, to demand an explanation. But the fear that had been her constant companion for so long counseled caution. She was still a fugitive, still dependent on this man's grudging charity. If he was part of a deeper, more complicated story, she needed to understand its shape before she acted. With a resolve that surprised her, Agnes slipped the locket into the small pouch she wore beneath her habit, a secret to be kept until the right moment. The fragile piece of their sanctuary was, for now, tainted with the cold poison of suspicion. The moment was not long in coming. 2 days later, a figure appeared at the mouth of the canyon, a stooped, elderly man leading a pack mule. Agnes's heart leapt into her throat, thinking it was one of Father Michael's men. But Thomas greeted the newcomer with a familiar, if not exactly warm, nod. "Silas," Thomas said, his voice flat. "Didn't expect you for another month." The man, Silas, was a peddler, his mule laden with the essentials of a frontier life. Sacks of flour, tools, bolts of cloth, and news. He was a lifeline to the world beyond the canyon, and as he unpacked his wares, he delivered his information in a wheezing, gossipy monotone. "Fever's bad down in Fairplay. Railroad's pushing through to Leadville, and there's a priest over in Alma. A real fire and brimstone type. Been asking questions." Agnes, who had been trying to remain inconspicuous by the fire with Lily, froze at his words. "That so?" Thomas asked, his tone carefully neutral as he examined a new axe handle. "Aye," Silas wheezed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the fire. "Name's Father Michael, stern-faced fella, offering a reward for information about a runaway nun. Seems she fled a convent back east with a babe in arms." The peddler's shrewd, watery eyes flickered toward Agnes. Funny coincidence, ain't it? The threat was no longer a distant memory. It was a tangible presence, just a few miles down the mountain. The canyon walls, which had felt like a fortress, now seemed to press in on her, suffocating her. Thomas finished his transaction with the peddler, trading a small pouch of gold dust for flour, salt, and coffee. He said nothing about the priest, his face an unreadable mask, but Agnes could feel the tension radiating from him. The sanctuary had been breached. That evening, the silence between them was different. It was no longer the quiet of two solitary people, but the taut, heavy silence of unspoken fear and suspicion. Agnes knew she could wait no longer. As Thomas stared into the fire, his thoughts clearly miles away, she took a deep breath and pulled the locket from her pouch. "I found this in Lily's swaddling blanket," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet evening. "When I was washing it by the creek." Thomas looked over, his eyes narrowing as he saw the small object in her hand. He took it from her, his large, calloused fingers fumbling with the tiny clasp. He didn't need to open it. Agnes could see from the sudden, sharp intake of his breath that he recognized it instantly. He stared at the locket lying in his palm, his face paling beneath his beard. "Where did you say you found this?" he asked, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Tucked into the hem. It must have been there all along. It was a gift," he said, his voice hollow. "I gave it to Sarah for our first anniversary. She never took it off." He finally looked up, his gray eyes boring into hers, filled with a desperate, questioning anguish. Who was this child? Agnes. The use of her name, not sister or some other impersonal title, was a shock. It was an acknowledgement of her as a person, an equal in this unfolding mystery. "Her name is Lily," Agnes answered softly. "She was left at the convent gates in a basket just after she was born. That's all I know." "I swear it." Thomas closed his eyes, the muscles in his jaw working. For a long moment, he was silent, and Agnes felt the fate of her and Lily hanging in the balance, suspended on the thread of his belief. "My wife," he began, his voice strained, "had a sister, Elizabeth, younger by 10 years. She was wild, a restless spirit, hated our small town, hated the life that was laid out for her." He stood and walked to the small, leather-bound trunk that held his few possessions. He opened it and removed a worn buckskin pouch. "Elizabeth fought with her father constantly. When she was 17, after a terrible argument, she ran away. Just vanished. We never heard from her again." He untied the pouch and carefully shook its contents into his hand. There was the faded photograph of a smiling, vibrant woman, Sarah, and a single, folded letter, its paper yellowed and creased. "This came a year ago," Thomas said, his voice thick with an emotion Agnes couldn't quite decipher. "A full year after Sarah and Mary had already gone. It was postmarked from a town not 20 miles from your convent." He handed the letter to Agnes. The handwriting was a frantic, looping scrawl, the words blurred in places as if by tears. "Dearest Sarah, forgive my long silence. Pride is a terrible sin, and I have been paying for mine. I have made a mess of my life. Sister, I fell in with a man who promised me the world and gave me nothing but heartache. Now I am with child and he is gone. I am alone and I am so terribly frightened. I have no one else to turn to. I know I have no right to ask, after all these years, but I am desperate. Can you help me? I am staying at a boarding house inn." The name of the town was the one where Agnes's convent was located. Agnes looked up from the letter, her heart pounding. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place with a terrifying, inexorable logic. "Elizabeth," she whispered. "Lily's mother." Thomas nodded, his face a mask of grief and dawning comprehension. "I never answered the letter. By the time it reached me, Sarah was gone. I couldn't bear it. Another loss. So I put it away. Tried to forget." His gaze fell on Lily, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. "Lily," he said, testing the name on his tongue. "Elizabeth, my wife's sister's child. My niece." The revelation was a seismic shock, rearranging the very foundations of their situation. Lily was not just a random foundling. She was his family, his last living connection to the woman he had lost. His initial, instinctive reaction to the baby, the whispered name Mary, had not been a memory of his daughter, but a flicker of a deeper, familial recognition, an echo of the woman in the photograph. Agnes felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. He hadn't been deceiving her. He had been as lost in this mystery as she was. "Thomas," she said, the name feeling natural on her lips for the first time. "Father Michael. He knows who she is. He must." The thought sobered them both. "Why would he hide it?" Thomas asked, his voice hardening. "Why hunt you down just to send her to an asylum? Because a child born of sin, abandoned on our doorstep, is a threat to the convent's reputation," Agnes answered bitterly. "But a child connected to a respectable, albeit deceased, local family, that's a different story. That's a scandal he couldn't control." Their fragile sanctuary had become something more. It was now a fortress, protecting not just a runaway nun and an orphan, but the last member of Thomas's family. The stakes, already impossibly high, had just been raised. They were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance, but a man and a woman united in a common, sacred purpose. But as this new, powerful bond formed between them, the world outside was closing in. The whisper of Father Michael's name was a promise of the coming storm. He was no longer just a distant threat. a phantom from Agnes's past. He was a hunter, and he was getting closer. Just as the full weight of their new reality settled over them, a small, choked sound came from the cradle. Lily was stirring, not with the usual fuss of a waking baby, but with a sharp, pained cry. Agnes rushed to her side, her heart lurching. The baby's face was flushed, her skin hot to the touch. The fever, which had been vanquished by the willow bark in their desperate vigil, was returning. Thomas was beside her in an instant, his hand going to Lily's forehead. A grim, haunted look crossed his face. "No," he whispered. "Not again." The fragile hope that had just been born between them was immediately threatened by the return of an old, familiar enemy. And this time, they both knew the real danger was not the fever itself, but the man who was hunting them, a man who would surely use a sick child as a weapon to achieve his own dark ends. As Agnes looked from the feverish baby to Thomas's stricken face, she saw a new terror on the horizon. While they had been uncovering the secrets of the past, Father Michael had been drawing his net tighter. She moved to the edge of the clearing, ostensibly to gather more firewood, but really to scan the canyon walls. Her eyes traced the familiar lines of the ridges, the dark silhouettes of the pines against the afternoon sky. And then she saw him, a lone figure, high up on the northern ridge, a black shape against the blue sky. He was watching the camp through a spyglass. It was Father Michael. He had found them. The fragile sanctuary had been breached, and a direct confrontation was now inevitable. The sight of the dark figure on the ridge sent a bolt of pure, unreasoning terror through Agnes. For a moment, she was not Anna, the woman who had found her strength in the wilderness, but Sister Agnes again, a frightened novice trapped in the suffocating shadow of Father Michael's authority. Her breath caught in her throat, and the world seemed to shrink to that single, menacing silhouette. Then, from the camp behind her, came Lily's weak, feverish cry. The sound was a clarion call, cutting through the paralysis of her fear. She was a mother, not a nun. She was a protector, not a fugitive. With a last, horrified glance at the figure on the ridge, she gathered the firewood she had dropped and raced back to the lean-to, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "He's here," she gasped as she burst into the small clearing, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I saw him, on the north ridge, watching us." Thomas looked up from where he was crushing more willow bark. His face, already grim with worry over Lily, hardened into a mask of cold resolve. He rose slowly to his feet, his large frame seeming to fill the small space, a bulwark of solid muscle and bone against the encroaching threat. "Get inside the lean-to," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that calmed the frantic edges of her fear. "Keep the baby out of sight." He moved with a sudden, startling efficiency. The weary recluse transformed into a man of action. There was no panic in his movements, only a grim, focused purpose. He kicked dirt over the fire, reducing its telltale smoke to a thin, almost invisible wisp. "We can't outrun him in these mountains," he said, his eyes scanning the canyon walls, assessing the terrain with a practiced eye. "He'd track us in hours. We have to make a stand here." Agnes hesitated, her mind still reeling. "But he has men, hounds." "This canyon is a fortress if you know its secrets," Thomas interrupted, his gaze locking with hers. "And I know every rock and crevice. Trust me, Anna." The use of her real name was a powerful anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. He saw her, not Sister Agnes, the runaway, but Anna, his partner in this desperate struggle. She gave a curt, determined nod and retreated into the lean-to with Lily, her own fear giving way to a fierce, protective resolve. Thomas moved to the back of the clearing, to a section of the rock wall that seemed solid but was, in fact, a cleverly disguised entrance. He pulled aside a curtain of ancient, petrified vines to reveal the dark, narrow opening of an abandoned mine tunnel. "In here," he commanded. "It's our best defense." He led her into the cool, musty darkness. A few yards in, the tunnel opened into a small, dry chamber. In the corner, a collection of supplies was neatly stacked: sealed tins of food, canteens of fresh water, extra blankets, and, most importantly, a long, cloth-wrapped object. "My emergency cache," Thomas explained as he lit a lantern, the warm glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. I set it up when I first came here. Never thought I'd need it for this. He unwrapped the long object. It was a rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth with use, its metal barrel clean and well-oiled. An old Sharps carbine from his time in the Union Army. I was a scout during the war, he said, his voice flat, as if speaking of another man's life. Learned a thing or two about ambushes and defensive positions. He checked the rifle's action with practiced hands. This canyon has only one real entrance, the way you came in. The rest of the walls are too steep to climb without proper gear. If I can block that path, it will buy us time. Block it how? Anna asked, her voice a whisper in the echoing chamber. With half a mountain, Thomas said grimly. He explained his plan. An unstable section of the cliff face overlooked the canyon entrance. With the right leverage, he could trigger a rock slide, sealing the canyon and trapping them inside, but also trapping Father Michael and his men out. As they prepared, moving the most essential supplies deeper into the mine for safety. The last of the barriers between them crumbled, washed away by the tide of shared danger. Thomas, seeing Anna's residual terror, spoke to her not as a dependent, but as an equal, a comrade in arms. He told her more about Elizabeth, filling in the gaps of the story from the tattered letter. He spoke of his wife's fierce, protective love for her younger sister, a love that had made her blind to the girl's recklessness. Sarah always believed Elizabeth had a good heart, he said, his voice thick with memory. She just needed to find her way, I think. I think Lily is Sarah's way of giving her that chance, even now. His words, his acceptance of Lily as a legacy of love rather than a burden of tragedy, unlocked the final, most painful secret in Anna's own heart. Lily is not just an orphan left at the convent, she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame and defiance. Her mother was a novice, a young girl named Catherine. She came to the convent seeking refuge, just as I did. She was already with child, a secret she kept until it was too late. Anna's voice dropped, her eyes fixed on the sleeping infant in the cradle they had brought into the mine. The birth was hard. Catherine, she didn't survive. She made me promise to protect her baby, to get her away from Father Michael. He saw the child as a stain on the convent's honor, a symbol of his failure to control his flock. He was going to send her away, to make her disappear. He called her a child of sin, but Catherine, she called her Lily. For purity, she said, for a new beginning. In sharing her deepest secret, Anna felt the last vestiges of Sister Agnes fall away. She was not a disgraced nun who had stolen a child. She was a mother who had kept a sacred promise. Her flight was not an act of cowardice, but one of profound, defiant love. Thomas listened in silence, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. When she had finished, he reached out and gently touched her arm, his calloused fingers a warm, steadying presence. You did the right thing, Anna, he said simply. You saved her. The simple validation was a balm to her wounded soul. They were no longer just a man and a woman united by circumstance. They were a team, partners in a fight for the future of the child who bound them together. The sound of a distant horn blast, a signal, echoed through the canyon, jolting them back to the immediate danger. They're coming, Thomas said, his voice grim. It's time. He picked up the rifle and the heavy iron pry bar he had retrieved from his camp. He looked at Anna, his gray eyes filled with a meaning that went far beyond words. He was entrusting her with everything he had left in the world. Stay here. No matter what you hear, don't leave this tunnel until I come for you. But what if, she began, the fear for his safety is sharp, physical pain. He cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. The tunnel goes deep into the mountain. If I don't make it back by dawn, he said, his eyes locking with hers, take Lily and keep going east. There's another way out, a small fissure that leads to the next valley. It's a hard climb, but you can make it. Don't look back. The unspoken love between them was a tangible thing in the close confines of the tunnel, a powerful, aching current that needed no words. He turned to go, but Anna's voice stopped him. Thomas. He looked back. Come back, she whispered. A small, sad smile touched his lips. I intend to. Then he was gone, a shadow disappearing into the fading light of the tunnel entrance. Anna was left alone with the sleeping baby, the rifle, and the terrifying, echoing silence. She moved to the mouth of the tunnel, her new vantage point giving her a clear, if distant, view of the canyon entrance. She could see them now, 3 figures on horseback, Father Michael in the lead, picking their way through the rocks. She watched as a different, smaller shadow, Thomas, made his way up the opposite cliff face, moving with the silent, sure-footed grace of a mountain cat. He disappeared behind a massive overhang, directly above the path where Father Michael and his men were now advancing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Anna's hands, slick with sweat, gripped the cool wood of the rifle stock. She held her breath, her ears straining for any sound above the whisper of the pines. Then it came, a low, grinding rumble that grew with terrifying speed into a deafening, thunderous roar. The entire canyon seemed to shudder. A river of rock and earth poured from the cliff face, a horrifying, unstoppable avalanche. Anna watched, her heart in her throat, as the tons of debris crashed down, completely obliterating the path below. A thick cloud of dust billowed up, obscuring everything. The roar slowly subsided, replaced by the clatter of smaller, settling stones and then an unnerving silence. Had he made it? Was he safe? Or had he been caught in the very avalanche he had created? Anna stared at the impenetrable wall of dust, clutching the rifle, holding the now wailing Lily close. She was alone, trapped, not knowing if the man who had become her protector, her partner, her hope, was alive or buried beneath a mountain of stone. The silence that followed the rock slide was more terrifying than the thunderous roar that had preceded it. It was an absolute, final silence, the sound of a world remade. Dust, thick and choking, filled the canyon, a gray shroud that hid the aftermath of the cataclysm. Anna stood at the mouth of the mine tunnel, frozen, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Lily, startled by the noise, wailed against her shoulder, her small cries the only sound in the unnerving stillness. Anna's eyes, wide with a fear that went beyond her own safety, scanned the high, treacherous ledge where she had last seen Thomas. Nothing. The dust was too thick, the distance too great. Despair, a cold and familiar companion, began to creep back into her soul. He was gone. She had found this fragile hope, this unexpected partnership, only to have it snatched away, buried under a mountain of rock. Then, through the settling dust, she saw it, a movement, a shadow detaching itself from the cliff face, a figure covered from head to foot in a fine gray powder, making his slow, careful way along the narrow ledge. Thomas. He was alive. A sob of relief, so powerful it was almost painful, escaped Anna's lips. She sagged against the rock wall of the tunnel, her legs suddenly weak, and pressed her face into Lily's soft blanket, her tears of gratitude soaking the fabric. By the time Thomas reached the tunnel entrance, the dust had mostly settled, revealing a canyon floor transformed. The entrance was completely sealed by a massive, impassable wall of rock and uprooted trees. They were safe from pursuit, but they were also trapped. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with dust and exertion. He looked like a ghost, his features blurred by the gray powder, but his eyes, when he wiped them clean, were clear and steady. "We are now," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she laid it on his arm, needing the physical proof that he was real, that he was safe. I thought you were." "It was close," he admitted, his own voice revealing the strain of the ordeal. The whole ledge shook, but it held. He looked at the wall of rock that now sealed their world. They won't be getting through that anytime soon. They were safe, but they were also utterly alone, sealed in their stone sanctuary. In the days that followed, a new, quieter rhythm established itself. The immediate threat was gone, but the future remained in unknown territory. They had a limited supply of food from Thomas's cache, and the canyon, while providing shelter, offered little in the way of sustenance. In this enforced period of quiet isolation, with the outside world held at bay, the last of the unspoken emotions between them finally rose to the surface. One evening, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire deep within the mine tunnel, Thomas looked over at Anna, who was stitching a repair in Lily's blanket, her face serene in the lantern light. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice a low rumble in the enclosed space, "about what comes next." Anna looked up, her needle poised. "If there is a next." "There is," Thomas said with a certainty that surprised her. "That rock slide didn't just create a wall. It created a boundary between the life I was living before and whatever comes after." He paused, choosing his words with a deliberation that spoke to their weight. I don't want to be that man anymore, Anna. The man hiding in the shadows, living with ghosts. When I saw you and Lily that first morning, it was like a stone tossed into a stagnant pool. You brought life back into this place. Back into me. Anna's heart quickened, but she remained silent, allowing him the space to speak the truth that had been building between them. I want to be a father to Lily, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not to replace Mary, but to honor her. To protect this child, our child, in a way I couldn't protect her. His gaze was intense, unwavering. And I want you to stay, not as a refugee I'm sheltering, but as my partner, to build a home with me, here, in this place that has somehow become ours. He finally used the name that was truly hers, a name that signified a new beginning. Stay with me, Anna. The simple, heartfelt plea was more powerful than any poetic declaration. Anna had entered this canyon as Sister Agnes, a woman fleeing a life of submission. She had survived through her own strength, but she had learned to live again through his. She had found her true calling not in the cold piety of the convent, but in the fierce, warm, and messy reality of creating a family. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. My name is Anna, she said softly, a statement of profound self-acceptance. And yes, Thomas, I will stay. Days turned into a week, just as their supplies began to dwindle and a new, more practical anxiety began to set in. A new sound echoed through the canyon. Not the roar of a rock slide, but the sharp, clear call of a human voice. Hello, anyone in there? Thomas and Anna exchanged alarmed glances. Thomas grabbed his rifle and moved cautiously toward the rock wall, motioning for Anna to stay back. Who's there? He called out, his voice sharp. Name's Marshal Thompson, the voice returned. U.S. Marshal out of Denver. I'm looking for a man named Father Michael and a woman named Sister Agnes. The world had found them after all. But this time, it was not the voice of a pursuer, but of the law. After a tense exchange, they learned the truth. The peddler, Silas, disturbed by the priest's relentless questions and the bounty on a nun's head, had reported the matter to the authorities in Denver. The marshal's investigation had quickly unraveled the secrets of the convent, the death of the young novice, Catherine, and Father Michael's frantic cover-up. The marshal informed them that Father Michael and his men had been found, their trail leading to the rock slide. Convinced their quarry was buried beneath the tons of rock, they had abandoned their pursuit. The priest had since been recalled by the church elders in the east to face a formal inquiry. The ordeal was over. You're free, ma'am, the marshal called through the rocks. And the child is no longer a ward of a convent that doesn't want her. The law recognizes you as her legal guardian. He promised to return with a crew to clear her path, a process that would take weeks. For now, he would leave them fresh supplies and the most precious gift of all, peace. The months that followed were a time of quiet, deliberate creation. Thomas, with a renewed sense of purpose, began to transform the lean-to into a proper cabin, a small but sturdy structure carved from the very stone that had once been their prison. Anna planted a small garden in a patch of sunlit soil near the creek. Her hands, once accustomed to the rosary, now finding a different kind of prayer in the tilling of the earth. Lily thrived. She grew from a fragile infant into a healthy, babbling toddler, her laughter echoing through the canyon. She took her first, wobbly steps one brilliant autumn afternoon, her small hands reaching not for one parent, but for both, as she toddled from Thomas's outstretched arms into Anna's waiting embrace. They were a family, forged not by law or by blood, but by a shared promise made in the heart of a storm. The world outside the canyon, with its rules and judgments, seemed a distant, half-forgotten dream. Here, in their small kingdom of rock and sky, they had everything they needed. The final image of their new life was one of profound and simple peace. As the sun set, painting the canyon walls in hues of rose and gold, Thomas and Anna sat on the porch of their newly built cabin. Lily played at their feet, her small hands batting at a wildflower. Anna wore a simple dress of blue calico, a far cry from the black habit of her former life. On a thin leather cord around her neck hung the small, silver locket. It was no longer a symbol of a hidden, painful past, but a cherished reminder of the winding, improbable path that had led her to this moment, to this man, to this child, to home. Thomas reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In the quiet contentment of the evening, in the shared glance that passed between them, in the trusting weight of their daughter's hand in theirs, everything that mattered was said. They had carved a new life, a new family, a new hope, from the very stone that had once imprisoned them. And in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, they had found their redemption.